What is going on, guys? Vanity here, back with volume 9 of the In the Style of series, this time covering the sound of Lapalux. This is the composition I'm going to be taking you through today. Just before I get into this, I've got a quick announcement to make. If you have any suggestions of who you'd like to see on this series, please comment them down below. Whichever comment receives the most thumbs up on each video will always be the following artist I cover. This series is dictated to exactly your suggestions and ideas. So next week I will be covering Esther from Soul Action. After that, I'll pick the most thumbed up comment on this video. Moving on. I'm going to start having a main focus in each one of these tutorials. So as each artist pretty much always uses the same core elements in their records, such as drums, bass, melodies and vocals, rather than repeating this over and over again, I'd still like to talk briefly on those points, but also to have a main focus area to centre the tutorial around. With Lapalux, it is going to be field recordings, found sounds and creative layering techniques. As in a typical Lapalux track, there are anywhere between 3 to 8 different layers and textures blending together to create this truly unique mesh of sounds. Now this is most evident in his Lushmore album released in 2015, however he does still have stripped back records that are a lot simpler in terms of their composition, such as Without You released on his 2013 album. This track alone has over 2 million plays on Spotify and is well worth a listen. I've mainly been listening to Lushmore to really gauge Lapalux's style, as I think it makes sense to focus on his most recent body of work to present an accurate deconstruction. The album itself contains 13 tracks that really seem to take the listener on a complete trip. Each track is extremely different from the last, with each containing an entirely different drum pattern featuring fresh and exciting samples. There is a big use of textures such as found sounds, vinyl crackle, tape hiss, just anything really to kind of dirty up that clean sound of digital music. I really loved in parts where he had duplicated the vocal, pitched it up, I'd say around an octave, and then used this duplication to kind of sit under the main vocal and just provide a delay. Now you can hear this in the last 40 seconds of his track Closure. There also seems to be a wind sample playing in the background, or perhaps it's just a tape hiss sample that you can also hear very clearly on Closure. Now you can also hear exactly the same sample on the next track on the album, Midnight Peelers, especially in the introduction. It is present on nearly all of the records on the album, perhaps providing a level of fluidity that is needed within a complete body of work. He produces his music in Ableton and uses a portable recorder on a regular basis to go out and capture sounds. Now I also do this from time to time and would recommend you all grab a Zoom portable recorder and just carry it with you wherever you go. Well, within reason anyway. For anyone who is interested, I use the Zoom H1, which now costs around £80 or $100. Everything I just said about Lapalux was from an interview which I'll link up in the description. He also went on to say in the same interview that he is a photographer in his spare time and also does a spot of singing in his records. Now the singing is pretty manipulated, so nothing super obvious. I'm guessing he's just using it as little samples here and there. He went on to say that his name Lapalux comes from a saying we have over here in the UK, in the lap of luxury, which basically means in conditions of great comfort and or wealth. Apparently he just said it slightly wrong, and from that was born the name Lapalux. Let's start with briefly covering the drums, and then I want to move on to the bass and the textures. The drums in this record sound like this, soloed. I said at the beginning of this video that Lapalux's drum sound can differ greatly from record to record, so these drums were inspired by his most well-known track, Without You, a kind of smooth, almost R&B sounding groove. The type of drums you use in a composition should be based and stylized around the musical elements contained in the track, which is why it can sometimes be a wise choice to start with the music, or perhaps not even have a specific formula for producing a record. So the kick drum in this record on its own sounds like this. Your simple low-end centered kick, which has seemed to be a staple sound among every artist I've covered in this series so far. Now this is my updated standard processing chain. I've got the same EQ configuration I use in pretty much all of my tracks, and then this new plugin, the Slate Virtual Bush Compression. Now one thing I would like to say on this subject is that compression on drum samples isn't always necessary. Use your ears to determine if the sound actually needs it, and not just automatically place a plugin on the channel. Most sample pack companies compress drum samples going into the pack. I certainly do on all of mine, so unless you're layering multiple samples together, chances are you won't need it. So on to the snare drum. This is how the snare sounds on its own. So the snare is a combination of two different hits, a basic tight snare layered with a click or clap sample. The processing is exactly the same as on the kick drum, so I'm going to move straight onto the percussion, which sounds like this soloed. The percussion group is made up from 3 different layers: a sampled bongo loop that I've kind of chopped and rearranged, 2 varying hi-hats, and a shaker. Again with the same EQ and compression configuration, except I'm rolling off everything under 300Hz as opposed to 100Hz. It's worth mentioning at this point that the kick and snare are being sidechained to everything in this track. This is done to create a similar sound to Lapalux, although it does seem to be a commonality of most artists I've covered. All of these samples are from my Lapalux sample pack, the link to which will be in the description below. There should also be a card popping up on the screen here, which will take you to where you can download it. So moving on to the sub bass, which sounds like this soloed. The sound is a simple sine wave being generated by Serum. You can see here, it's just the initialized patched with oscillator A turned off and the sub oscillator turned on and set on the sine wave. Extremely simple. I've then got the standard max bass from Waves and the Camel Crusher from Camel Audio, followed by a utility plugin. I'm doing something that some may find interesting, and it's kind of a manual compressor. So you can see here my automation on the track, and you'll notice that it's going up in volume on these last 2 notes here. I'll just zoom in. So you can see here the amplitude is increasing on these last 2 notes. Now this is because certain bass notes will drop in volume compared with others in a single melody. Now usually speaking, E, F and G work the best for providing a full thick sound from your synth patch. The reason for this can be narrowed down to resonant frequencies, but it's actually pretty easy to fix. Most people will use compressors for controlling the dynamics of a sound. I say most people, nearly everyone will. However, sometimes a note from the bass can sound louder to the human ear, but not actually register as a louder note on a digital plugin. Now I trust my ears more than my eyes, so I've automated the bass to what sounds like a consistent amplitude level to myself. Now perhaps this is a bit over the top, but nevertheless it did work. So that was the drums and bass in a nutshell. I'd like to now focus on how Lapalux uses plenty of textures as a base for his records, and then starts layering in melodic content over the top to craft his unique style. I've got the standard tape hiss and vinyl crackle, like I mentioned at the start of the tutorial. Lapalux seems to use this tape hiss in almost every one of his tracks on his new album. I've also got a rain and a wind field recording in here, but this is how all of the textures sound together. The most interesting sound I've got in here is probably the rain sample. This is how the rain started off sounding. And this is what I turned it into using this chain of plugins down here. An Effectrix, an auto filter, and a simple delay plugin. It just goes to show how you can manipulate sounds into something entirely different from their starting point, which actually leads me onto my next point. I personally think that producers don't give found sounds or field recordings the attention they truly deserve. A found sound is described as when a musician finds a recording or something that makes some kind of noise and adopts it into their music. Now, a field recording is defined as an audio recording produced outside of a recording studio. These terms are slightly different but also incredibly similar, and this paradox can be extremely interesting. So the last aspect I'd like to speak about, as always, is my mastering chain. So on this track, I've got the BX Control 2 from Brainworks. I think I've mentioned this plugin in just about every video I've done, but it is super dope for having on your master output. It's got tons of different things you can do. What I'm using it for in this instance is to convert everything under 250Hz into mono and boost the stereo width of the track by 25%. The next plugin is perhaps the newest addition to the chain, and it is this one, Virtual Tape Machines from Slate Digital. I personally love the sound of tape, and I'm always experimenting with different plugins and different kind of techniques to get it into my own mixes. Now, Lapalux seems to also do the same, and I think almost every artist I've covered deploys certain methods to kind of recreate that tape sound. I've then got two PSP old-timer plugins. One is compressing the middle of the track, and one is compressing the sides. Again, I've spoke about these in almost every tutorial, but they just work some magic on records. They really sweeten up the high-end details in the record and seem to almost add a touch of sparkle around that kind of 12K area. The final plugin on here is my go-to limiter, which is the L2 from Waves. I'm leaving 0.2 dB for any intersample peaks that may occur. Now, how I'll usually operate with this, I'll adjust my threshold till the track is sitting around -10 RMS, or until I'm taking around 3 dB off on my gain reduction meter here. But if I need to take off more than -3 dB to reach my desired RMS level, I'll then go back to the track and I'll make further adjustments till I can just take off 3 dB and get the track sitting around -10. That's my approach on limiting records. Now, I've actually found that the most kind of common mistake in most producers' records is they have the snare way too loud. I was also guilty of this for God knows how long. I like my snares nice and loud, but you have got to turn them down in order to bring up the rest of the track. So I'll just say that again, you've got to turn your snares down in order to bring up the volume of the whole track, while only taking off a maximum of -3 dB. Any more than -3, I feel like it squashes the peaks of the track or squashes the dynamics just a bit too much for me. Obviously it will depend on the genre of music you're making. -3 dB is just my limit for limiting, pun intended. That's it for this one, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember to like and subscribe to make sure you never miss any of my content. Also, make sure to click that little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified when a new video is ready for your viewing. Thank you for watching, and until next time, I'm out. Peace.